Hey everybody, welcome to OrthoWorld's State of the Orthopedic Industry. I'm Mike Evers, the author of OrthoWorld's Orthopedic Industry Annual Report. And what I'd like to do today is share some of our data and takeaways from the most recent installment of the report. But first, I want to thank our sponsor, Orchid. Orchid is a worldwide leader of manufacturing solutions for the orthopedic market. It is a strategic sourcing partner that is designed with simplicity and speed to optimize solutions for orthopedic procedures. Orchid has the broadest portfolio in the industry, ranging from concept to finished goods manufacturing and packaging, and can improve your customer supply chains through its supply chain solutions. So thank you once again to Orchid. Let's start with an overview of how the segments performed in 2021, as well as the top 10 companies in the industry. And for me, really the storyline for 2021 is a promising recovery blunted by late year pressures. Overall, the industry grew 12.8% compared to 2020, which is about 1% above 2019. And I know we're all probably pretty tired of 2019 as a metric, but I think if you'll indulge me this one last time, it is a pretty useful framing device for how the year went. If we think about 2021, really, and in the last 3 years or 2 years, the idea was we'd have a weak first half and then recovery would happen in the second half. And that's sort of how the year started off, with a softness in the beginning of the year based on the prior year's surge. But by the time Q2 came around, we were seeing some early signs of recovery that were frankly ahead of schedule. However, by the time we got to Q3, we saw a slowdown and some signs of trouble. And of course, by the time we got to the year end, Q4, we had the double barrel variants of Delta and Omicron that shut down procedures across the globe and pushed some headwinds into this year as well. So by our estimates, the orthopedic market generated $53.6 billion in revenue for 2021, about the same as 2019. But really throughout the course of the pandemic, the contributions of each product segment didn't change by much. In joint replacement, that's still probably a little underweight, same with spine, but I think that's probably just a few tenths of a percentage point that will equalize over the next year, year and a half. As we look at each individual segment here, this chart shows the percentage growth of each segment. The light green is versus 2020, and the dark green is versus 2019. And you can see, as it has throughout the pandemic, knees have lagged the recovery curve for other segments. But I think the overall story here is even in where we've seen progress in extremities and hips, sports medicine, those segments are still below their historical growth rates. Another way that we look at the industry is by company size or revenue tier. And this, I think, is a great visualization of the consolidation trend in the industry, where we have 7 companies accounting for almost 2/3 of all of the revenue generated in orthopedics. And that number is going to grow here in the next year, 2 years, where a company like Globus is going to crest 1 billion this year, and DJO, now known as Enovis, will make the 1 billion mark in their reconstruction business in the near future. Here are the top 10 companies by revenue, and again, comparing their growth versus 20 and 19. And I think you can even just squint and make this slide go blurry and still get the takeaway here, where only 2 companies had outsized growth versus 2019. That's Stryker, and of course that is through their acquisition and integration of Wright Medical. But Globus, at least to this point, hadn't made any major acquisitions. So all of their growth is through execution and what they called their virtuous cycle of robotics. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. For now, let's take a little bit of a deeper look into each product segment, and we'll start with joint replacement that we estimated generated $19.4 billion in 2021. And as you can see, an extremely top-heavy segment dominated by the four big players of Zimmer Biomet, Stryker, DePuy Synthes, and Smith and Nephew. But if we expand that view out to the top 10 companies, you can see that Medacta also had a really strong year. And then, of course, DJO had contributions both from strong organic growth and the bevy of acquisitions they've made. And I would expect both of those factors to remain true for them going forward. My joint replacement takeaways, for me, it has to start with enabling technology, robotics specifically, where we saw just how powerful a combination of robotics and cementless is through Stryker's, Mako, and their cementless offerings that have really driven their market share gains, not just in 2021, but for the past several years. And really nobody in the space has yet caught up to them. Despite being a very large and mature segment, it's still, joint replacement is still attractive as an acquisition space. And we would expect to see Globus Medical and some others throw their hat into the ring in the next few years. And I think fueling that attractiveness are some fast growing procedure categories like shoulder and ankle. As we jump over to spine, spine generated $9.6 billion in revenue for 2021, led by Medtronic, DePuy Synthes, Stryker, NuVasive, and Globus Medical. As we expand that out, though, we've already shown Globus Medical's incredible 2021, but you could see ATEC just blowing the roof off of this chart. I would say for the biggest companies in Medtronic, their not newfound, but recent focus on claiming market share they believe belongs to them has been paying off. DePuy Synthes has been a share donor in spine for quite some time, and I think their problems in the segment predate the pandemic by quite a bit. But then, as I said, Globus Medical, really strong performance. And then ATEC, who, when I first got into orthopedics, ATEC was in free fall. So it's been pretty exciting to see the turnaround of that company. But I would note just how heavily they've spent to fuel that growth. And it's interesting to see how quickly they'll be able to reach that break-even point. Spine takeaways, number one, a lesson that I learned early, and it shows itself again every year, is that it pays to specialize in spine. Large, diversified companies have a really hard time mounting an effective spine offense. This year, we also had our semi-annual rumors of NuVasive being acquired or taken over. I believe this year it was supposed to be to Globus, which never really made much sense. But I think it's fair to acknowledge that NuVasive was challenged by the pandemic perhaps a little bit more than their peers. But I think based on recent quarters and some moves they've made to expand their reach in spine, and I think eventually when they do get all the pieces of their Pulse platform on the market, I think NuVasive will be just fine. And then, as we mentioned previously, the virtuous cycle of robotics as coined by Globus Medical. And that's sort of a positive feedback loop in which their technology is compelling new surgeons to come to Globus, but also competitive reps are coming to Globus and bringing coveted accounts and surgeons with them. So it's been a force multiplier across Globus's entire business. The trauma market generated $7.4 billion in 2021, according to our estimates, and is yet another really top-heavy segment, with DePuy Synthes and Stryker dominating that market. Just to point out quickly that Acumed and Osteomed have merged, and we're reporting them together. Hence, they moved up to the 5th largest position. As we expand our view out to the top 10, I think you could basically split this chart in half, in the left and right. On the left-hand side, with the larger companies, particularly Stryker and Smith and Nephew, getting that outsized growth through acquisitions. Stryker, of course, through Wright Medical, and then Smith and Nephew acquired the orthopedic assets of Integra Life Sciences. However, on the right-hand side of the chart, the smaller companies, We saw a really strong year from Medartis and Paragon 28. And I would even extend that out just past the top 10 to a company like Treece Medical Concepts, another company that grew at many multiples of the market. Our trauma takeaways are, as we mentioned, companies like Paragon 28 and Treece Medical, who have a very narrow focus within the trauma segment, even down to the individual procedure. And it has given them a compelling competitive advantage over their larger competitors. I spilled quite a bit of ink over the last 1.5 years, wondering about how the Stryker and Wright integration would go. What kind of disruption would it bring, and who would benefit from it? In the event, however, it seems like Stryker threaded the needle. Big orthopedic integrations are hard, they just are. And as far as I can tell, though, Stryker had minimal disruption from this massive integration. And in fact, according to their leadership, even had some pleasant surprises where Wright was a better company than they thought when they bought them. And then I think, especially in the foot and ankle space, where there isn't a ton of consensus on procedure technique for some things, outcomes are not as good as they could be, revision rates are very high. I think that is a space that is ripe for enabling technology to improve those outcomes. And we see that with a company like Paragon 28 and their Smart 28 digital ecosystem. As we move on to sports medicine, $5.9 billion in 2021, another segment dominated by a duo of Arthrex and Smith & Nephew in this case. But I will say that sports medicine is getting more focus than it traditionally had from the large diversified players. And we'll talk about why in just a second. And you can see an example of that here, where Stryker grew 19.9% in sports medicine versus 2019. And that's really just through focus, investment, and I think in large part, their investment in the ASC environment. Within sports medicine, one of our most covered news items and press releases were for rotator cuff repair and ACL repair, two markets that are as of now, very underpenetrated and represent great growth opportunities for innovative products and companies. If you recall, in 2020, capital sales were sort of bifurcated along robotic lines and then everything else. We saw in 2020, robots had great success in capital placement, but things in sports medicine, cameras, positioners, did not perform as well. So gladly, it was nice to see in 2021 that capital sales rebounded for sports medicine. And as I alluded to, as more companies place more focus on sports medicine, a big part of the reason is that sports medicine can be a doorway into the ASC environment. And you see Stryker, for instance, with their dedicated ASC offense, where if they can get in, then they can sell across their entire portfolio in the ASC. And I think that'll be an increasingly common business model for the largest players. Last but not least, orthobiologics that generated $5.2 billion in 2021. And as you can see, by far the most evenly distributed segment in orthopedics. As we look at the top 10 companies, I think really for me, the takeaway is Bioventus here. Bioventus has had a very busy couple of years with the IPO and then a bevy of acquisitions. And then they are able to take share across a couple different segments, subsegments of orthobiologics in bone graft substitutes and visco supplements. As I mentioned, bone graft substitutes were by far our most popular news item in orthobiologics for 2021, I think accounting for about 60% of the press releases that we covered. And in particular, cell-based bone graft substitutes are growing above the market in the mid-single digits. So a great opportunity there. We've seen for a couple of years now an ongoing shift in visco supplements away from 3 and 5 injection treatments to single injections. That is continuing. And then really, I think specifically of Bioventus and among the smaller companies, Anika Therapeutics, as great examples of orthobiologic companies that have diversified their revenue in adjacencies both within orthopedics and with outside of orthopedics, as in Bioventus's foray into peripheral nerve stimulation and some rehabilitation products and services. Before we wrap up, let's take a quick look at how I think 2022 will shake out and some of the years going forward. As we mentioned, in 2021, we estimate the market grew 12.8%, that last percentage in the gray there. Moving forward into this year, I believe we're going to see continued progress, but I think some of the overhanging pressures that are still in the market are going to keep us from getting all the way back to quote unquote normal. Although I am hopeful by 2023, as we get into that 3.6% range, 3.7%, where it's we can finally say we've come through the storm and we are back to at least our new normal. What are some of the factors contributing to this forecast? Well, number one, I think the wild card is the hospital staffing issue. And that is going to be a rate limiter for everything else. The global supply chain, some of the companies we cover have reported significant problems and others have reported next to no disruption on that front. But I think it's fair to say overall in the industry, it is definitely a headwind. And then finally, this idea of a growing backlog of procedures and the idea that orthopedic patients are pretty sticky. They stay in the funnel, they'll eventually get their surgery. Many of these disease states do not improve over time. But what I don't think we're going to see is a massive rebound in any one quarter. I think we'll see over 18 months, 24 months, a lot of these procedures trickle back into the market. And then finally, based on the companies that have reported in Q1, public companies as a group, they are up mid-single digits versus Q1 of 2021. So I think based on that, it's a pretty good proxy to say that the market is improving and certainly had a pretty good March. What we saw in Q1 of 2022 is really varied performance and drivers. Some companies like Globus, who have been just super strong for a long time, ran out of gas in Q1, but I expect they'll pick back up. Stryker was in that mid-single digit range. And then, as we know, Zimmer Biomet spun off their dental and spine business into ZimVie. ZimVie was one of the companies that did not do so great in Q1. I think they were down about 13%. But as I said, overall, in our coverage universe, we see the market up about mid-single digits. Something that was consistent throughout companies in Q1 was the capital sales lull. Stryker acknowledged it, Globus Medical, several companies where I think absenteeism was the major factor. Stryker cited that sometimes that the folks who were going to build out a new space for a robotic delivery were sick, and so a lot of those orders, a lot of those placements are going to get pushed into later 2022. We've seen reports that an analysis of healthcare workers now versus before the pandemic found a 400,000 shortfall in staffing. Whatever the number really is, I think it's significant, and we see it really limiting how fast the market can recover. And excuse me if you've heard this before, but our best educated guess is that the market will continue to improve throughout 2022, with the second half being particularly strong, and hopefully getting us back into those normal growth ranges. So that's all we have today. I want to thank you for your attention. And as always, comments and feedback is welcome. You can reach me at evers@orthoworld.com. And thanks again to our sponsor, Orchid. We'll see you next time.